Friday morning sunlight sliced through the frosted windows of the Selkirk Mental Hospital, casting pale geometric shapes across the polished floor. Jessie stood a respectful distance from the nurse's station, holding Kira's heavy green sweater over his arm. The telemetry hold had confirmed what Jessie hoped. Kira was fighting her way back to baseline. The synthetic hallucinogen had been successfully flushed from her system, and her neurological responses were realigning with their standard mathematical precision. Because of this progress, the attending physician had authorized a brief vehicular excursion to test her sensory tolerance outside the sterile ward. Deborah, however, was locked in a tense logistical dispute with the doctor. The formidable aunt had arrived with a small entourage of relatives who were currently sequestered in the main lobby, treating the hospital protocols like a negotiation she fully intended to win. "She needs to get used to people first," the doctor explained, adjusting his glasses. "Her chemical balance is delicate. We are reintroducing environmental stimuli in highly controlled, incremental stages. Flooding her perimeter with multiple individuals will trigger an unnecessary adrenaline spike." Deborah crossed her arms, her navy blue parka rustling aggressively. "Family is more important than people. They are known, historical variables, not strangers off the street. They are here to provide a structural support system. Clinically speaking, they are still a crowd," the doctor replied firmly. "The policy is absolute. One person may enter the ward at a time to minimize sensory load. Jessie is her designated escort for this car ride. The rest of your family unit will have to wait until her discharge parameters are met." Deborah narrowed her eyes but gave a short, brisk nod, accepting the medical boundary to protect her niece. She turned her sharp gaze to Jessie. "Keep her grid completely stable. No unverified variables." "I will maintain a flawless perimeter," Jessie assured her. Minutes later, Kira emerged in her structured denim and combat boots. She accepted her green sweater from Jessie, carefully adjusting the cuffs to ensure symmetrical fabric distribution. Together, they navigated the fluorescent-lit corridors and pushed through the heavy double doors. The Manitoba wind hit them instantly, a biting force that smelled of frozen asphalt. The concrete sidewalk had been meticulously swept, but the fluctuating morning temperatures had left a deceptive, near-invisible glaze of ice. Kira took a calculated step forward. Instead of finding solid friction, her combat boots met zero traction. Her center of gravity immediately destabilized. Her arms began to windmill in a rapid, chaotic circle as her feet scrambled desperately against the slick concrete. The laws of physics refused to negotiate, and she landed squarely on her backside with a heavy, muffled thud. Jessie dropped to his knees instantly, his heart hammering violently. He anticipated a catastrophic sensory overload, a complete shutdown of her processing capabilities due to the unpredictable physical shock. He reached out, his mind already formulating an immediate extraction protocol to carry her back to the ward. Instead of a sharp gasp of panic, a bright, melodic sound cut through the freezing air. Kira was laughing. Jessie froze, utterly stunned. He stared at her, his eyes wide, as he gently gripped her gloved hands and pulled her back to her feet. The laughter was genuine, bubbling up from her chest and warming the frigid space between them. "I apologize for the sudden loss of vertical stability," Kira giggled, brushing crystallized snow from her jeans. But the kinetic energy transfer was entirely absurd. It was exactly like a cartoon. "A cartoon," Jessie echoed, processing the joyful anomaly. "Yes," she said, her hazel eyes dancing with unfiltered amusement. "When somebody tries to stay upright on the ice, and their legs are moving at maximum velocity, but you go absolutely nowhere. Just like a cartoon character suspended in midair before gravity finally activates. The visual data is highly entertaining." Jessie let out a long breath, a warm smile spreading across his face. Her resilience was breathtaking. I am glad your physical compression algorithms survived the impact flawlessly. My structural integrity remains completely uncompromised, Kira confirmed, slipping her hand into his as they navigated to his vehicle. The interior of Jessie's car offered a mathematically reliable acoustic environment. He adjusted the heating vents to maintain optimal thermal regulation. They drove aimlessly around Selkirk for 20 minutes, treating the vehicular motion as a predictable rhythm. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was perfectly calibrated and secure against the town's gray concrete and towering snowbanks. Eventually, Kira calculated a requirement for nutritional intake. They pulled into a local Pizza Hut, a franchise she favored for its standardized menu architecture and predictable interior geometry. They claimed a booth in the far corner, effectively reducing the perimeter threat. Kira slid in with her back to the wall, granting her a complete visual sweep of the dining room. However, it was the peak of the Friday lunch rush. Waitstaff hurried between tables with clattering metal trays, the industrial soda machine hissed aggressively, and a nearby table of 6 teenagers generated an erratic, high-decibel acoustic output. Jessie watched Kira's shoulders slowly inch upward. Her fingers began to tap a rapid, disjointed rhythm against the laminated table, her gaze darting frantically as she attempted to process the overlapping variables. The sensory bandwidth of the room was rapidly approaching her maximum capacity. "Kira," Jessie said, keeping his voice steady and perfectly modulated to her exact operational frequency. He did not reach across the table to touch her, strictly respecting her physical boundaries during an active sensory spike. Her hazel eyes snapped to him, wide and slightly unfocused by the sheer volume of data flooding her receivers. "The environmental data in this sector is too dense for efficient processing," Jessie instructed gently. "I need you to narrow your bandwidth. Do not attempt to calculate the background variables. Focus your visual and auditory receivers entirely on my coordinates." Kira swallowed hard, her tapping fingers slowing slightly. "The acoustic interference is peaking. The teenage unit is highly unpredictable." "They are merely external noise," Jessie assured her, leaning forward to fill a larger percentage of her field of vision. "They are not part of our operational grid. I am your trusted constant. Look directly at my eyes. Focus on me instead of the people." Kira locked her gaze onto his deep brown eyes. She took a slow, deliberate breath, matching the steady rhythm Jessie visually demonstrated with his own chest. The erratic tapping stopped entirely. The chaotic blur of the busy restaurant began to fade into a manageable, muted hum, isolated outside their immediate perimeter. "My baseline is stabilizing," Kira reported quietly, the rigid tension leaving her spine as she melted back against the vinyl booth. "Your visual coordinates provide an excellent anchor point." "I will always be right here to balance the equation," Jessie said, his voice an unyielding shield. Kira nodded, reaching across the table to briefly tap the back of his hand. The surrounding noise continued to swirl, but within the strict confines of their corner booth, the variables were perfectly secure. Dr. Evans folded his chart in the corridor outside the telemetry ward. "Her neurological baseline is stabilizing." Dr. Evans folded his chart in the corridor outside the telemetry ward. "Her neurological baseline is stabilizing," he explained. "But you must prepare for a psychological shift. The chemical intrusion wasn't just a physical shock. It was a complete override of her sensory defenses. She will likely exhibit a heavily modified view of the median population. The trauma altered her algorithms." Deborah frowned, her navy blue parka rustling. "What does that mean for her recovery? She already maintains—" "Her trusters have shrunk," the doctor replied. "She will be significantly less trusting of strangers. More importantly, she will display heightened defensive reactions toward anyone who has historically caused her friction. The poison stripped away her tolerance for masking." Deborah leaned heavily against the cinderblock wall. She knew the historical variables all too well. Kira had grown up as the sole female in a chaotic homeschool environment, surrounded by one brother and three boisterous boy cousins. They shared an unpredictable daily schedule. The worst of the friction had always generated from her oldest cousin, Bert. Bert had always treated interactions with Kira as a dominance metric. He constantly competed with her. He used to intentionally bump her meticulously aligned textbooks and act as an erratic, nerve-grating presence in her carefully ordered world. "Bert," Deborah muttered, looking entirely defeated. The post-release celebration was already a logistical hazard. Bert is always pushing her boundaries. He thinks it is funny to test her routines. If he pushes her now, she will process his interference as a systemic threat and react accordingly, the doctor warned. Deborah straightened her spine. "I will handle it. Bert will be on his absolute best behavior, or he will be permanently barred from the perimeter." Miles away, inside the familiar geometry of Pizza Hut, Jessie maintained a visual lock with Kira. Her baseline had temporarily stabilized, but the environmental hazard was rapidly escalating. 6 teenagers in the adjacent booth had transitioned to a frantic game of table football. They were aggressively flicking a folded paper triangle, slamming the vinyl, and shouting with unpredictable frequency. Kira's gaze darted toward the noise. Her hands curled into tight fists, knuckles turning white. The acoustic spikes were shattering the protective buffer Jessie had established. Jessie didn't wait for a system failure. He held up a hand, catching a passing waiter. Jessie dropped his clinical precision, reverting to the firm voice he used for the rest of the world. "Excuse me," Jessie said, his voice carrying undeniable authority. "Those kids are out of hand. My girlfriend is dealing with a severe medical recovery, and that erratic noise is hurting her. You need to tell them to keep it down or ask them to leave." The waiter noted Jessie's uncompromising expression. "I will take care of it right now, sir." The waiter marched over to the teenagers. Jessie couldn't hear the exact words, but the waiter's rigid posture delivered the final warning. For a suspended second, the game ceased. Then, the collective teenage ego rebelled. They opted for an exaggerated, disruptive exit, shoving their heavy chairs back simultaneously. Metal legs scraped violently against the tile floor. They shouted sarcastic apologies and slammed the heavy glass exit door on their way out into the freezing parking lot. The concentrated burst of chaotic noise was a direct assault on Kira's sensory receivers. She folded forward instantly, pressing her forehead flat against the cold, laminated table. She pulled her green sweater collar over her ears, breathing raggedly. The disruption felt like a physical weight pressing against her skull. Jessie remained perfectly still, waiting for the painful echo to fade. He leaned closer across the table without breaching her physical boundary. He needed to be her anchor. "The hostile variables have vacated the grid," Jessie said softly, returning seamlessly to his structured, clinical cadence. "The acoustic environment is returning to a manageable baseline." Kira's voice was muffled against the table, thick with painful vulnerability. "My processing hardware is malfunctioning, Jessie. The noise bothers me significantly more now than it did before. I used to be able to compartmentalize that decibel range without a system crash. What made my brain change?" Jessie looked at her red-dyed hair, his chest aching with compassion. He kept his hands firmly on his side of the table, offering absolute reliability. "Your hardware is not malfunctioning," Jessie explained, his tone steady and completely devoid of pity. "You experienced a severe chemical breach. You were poisoned with a synthetic hallucinogen. That substance forced your sensory receivers to operate at catastrophic levels. Your system is traumatized, meaning your defensive algorithms are hypersensitive to unpredictable stimuli. It is a logical biological response." Kira shifted slightly against the laminate, turning so one hazel eye could observe him. "If the defensive algorithms remain elevated, my operational capacity in public sectors will be diminished. Then we will adjust the parameters of the public sectors," Jessie countered immediately, his voice an unyielding rock. To recalibrate, I will accommodate it. I am a fixed variable in your equation. If an environment is too loud, we terminate the excursion. I am not going anywhere. Kira blinked slowly, processing the data. The erratic rhythm of her breathing smoothed out, syncing perfectly with the calm rise and fall of Jessie's chest. Before we initiate the return transit to the hospital, Jessie continued, introducing a new logistical path, I calculate that we require a secondary thermal shock to override the lingering stress. I propose we navigate to Dairy Queen and acquire 2 blizzards. The logic was flawlessly tailored. The intense, predictable coal input and the location offered a highly familiar operational flow. Kira slowly peeled her forehead off the table. She straightened her spine, meticulously adjusting her green sweater to ensure the cuffs were perfectly symmetrical. She looked directly at Jessie, the deep anxiety replaced by a quiet, calculating calm. That, Kira stated firmly, is a very good idea.